You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, where we are waiting for the return of President Biden. He's on his way now after his trip to India for the G20, of course, the stop along the way in Vietnam, where he played down claims in a news conference that the U.S. wants to isolate China.
I met with his number two person here in India today. So it's not like there's a crisis if I don't personally speak to him. It'd be better if I did. But I think, look, this is not a criticism. It's an observation. He has his hands full right now.
So where are we in the relationship? And what comes of this trip? We're joined in studio by Michelle Jamrisko, my old colleague, now with us in Washington, D.C. It's great to see you carrying the title Bloomberg News White House senior reporter. So let's start with the takeaways here and the messaging. Is the U.S. learning, is the president learning new ways to counter China? It was widely noted that President Xi was not in the room for this confab. It gave the president free rein to do what he needed to do.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, you know how these summits usually go. It's a lot on form and style over substance. And I think in terms of that first category, style and form, I think he's checking some boxes here. He saw the opening, China and Russia absent from this summit. He wants to move in and kind of appeal to the so-called global South countries that have been asking for more from this U.S.-led coalition. And he did do that. He spoke to them. He spoke to them in a lot of their own language. And he was speaking to China's so-called weakness right now. It's kind of weakness in its position economically as well as potentially politically. So I think that quote kind of says it all. He says he has his hands full right now talking about President Xi. That was a not so veiled swipe also, at what they're dealing with economically in China and what that means for potentially their position of power in the world.
He even seemed to indicate that it would keep China from invading Taiwan, which is a headline that seems to be resonating here. The communique always comes with a certain amount of angst, not much more than this time, though. Officials say they worked on this through 300 hours of meetings. It does not single out Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, but it does say that there were different views and assessments of the situation. What do we take from the communique, whether you like the writing or not? I could read it to you here. All states must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition. But for many, it just didn't go far enough.
Yeah, leaning on the UN language there was the safest way to go. In order to bring the representatives from China and Russia on board for some sort of G20 agreement. Now, remember, over the past couple of years, and ever since the war started, really, there have been a lot of tie-ups in communique language because the U.S.-led coalition wanted to say Russia is the aggressor because they said something about sanctions. This time, those two components were removed. They leaned on that UN language, just the facts, and they could kind of focus on other things. So sort of a short-term sacrifice. Of course, Ukraine and others not pleased, but the U.S. saw an opening to kind of push forward on other issues. And in order to do that, they wanted to kind of leave the war language to the side for a bit.
We're spending time with Bloomberg White House reporter Michelle Jamrisko, senior reporter, I should say. And it's a perfect time for you to join us because you were way ahead on this idea of the global South rising, which is something that is now a mainstream part of the conversation. It certainly was on display at this G20 on the recent visit to the White House by Prime Minister Modi. Now they've each had a visit here, and it's really changed the conversation as the president and the U.S. try to turn away from Russia and China. But it's a lot more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yeah, and in our teams, we were looking at this before it was cool, right? It's kind of become this big issue of talking about the global South and this tagline. What does it mean, actually? Well, I mean, this is years in the making, but, people are starting to wake up to the fact that powers like India, which is becoming an even bigger economic power and certainly a people power, most populous nation now, powers like India and Vietnam and the others are so-called swing states. So the U.S. needs to kind of convince them on certain issues. They're a bit bothered over the past few years, to say it lightly, about things like trying to get involved in the U.S.-China trade war or sanctions on Russia or the pandemic. They don't see this U.S.-led global order from post-World War II onwards working for them today, and they want changes. They want big changes, MDB reform. They want different trade and investment deals. They want the U.S. to show up at the table with money, not just platitudes and
Did this G20 do anything to change that?
I mean, I think that he's talking the talk. Biden was seen to be kind of speaking the language, as we said earlier, about, what does the global South want to hear in terms of infrastructure investment deals, in terms of MDB reform. So MDB reform has been one of the ones that the U.S. has really been plugging as a response to these global South requests. And we heard from U.S. Treasury Undersecretary Jay Shambaugh last week leading into the G20 summit, talking about how, yes, the IMF and World Bank are going to be looking at member quotas, giving shareholders more power. So in essence, giving global South countries more say in how those institutions are run, and hopefully getting more money toward real crisis issues and not just these high-fluting issues like climate, which the MDBs are kind of ill-positioned to tackle.
You can see why she's senior White House reporter for Bloomberg News. I'm so glad that you're back in the States
to be back
from
here
Singapore, right? How many years were you there?
6 years there.
6 years. Amazing. And welcome back to you and your family.
Thank
Don't
you.
be a stranger here on Sound On. Many thanks for the insights. Michelle Jamrisko with us here on Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. As we add another voice to the conversation, I've been looking forward to this as well, because the op-ed jumped off the page in advance of this G20. The headline from Craig Singleton: China's military is going global. He is with us now, senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Craig, it's great to see you. Where to begin as we talk to Michelle about the emerging global South? You seize in your story on what's happening in Cambodia at the Ream Naval Base, and you point this out as the example to start your piece on what China's doing from Africa, all the way to the South China Sea, establishing strategic strongpoints, as they're called, to protect trade routes. But is there a lot more to it? This is about projecting power, isn't it, Craig?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I mean, this impending inauguration of China's, what will be their first Indo-Pacific military outpost in Cambodia, it just represents a major evolution in China's defense posture. But I think beyond Ream, right, China is employing all of these innovative asymmetric tactics to sort of undercut and offset American military might. And it has some pretty serious implications for, I think, the United States and its allies. And you're right, it centers around this notion of establishing strategic strong points around key maritime choke points and along key trade routes around the world. And sometimes those strong points will look like military bases like Djibouti and the one that's coming online in Cambodia. Other times they might just be agreements that let the Chinese pull in their military for refueling. At the end of the day, the Chinese are not going to go base for base with the United States. What we really have to understand as a country, right, is the strategic intent behind a lot of these moves. And that really has to do with confounding and constraining U.S. policymakers during short of war scenarios and even during a contingency over Taiwan.
How about that? You mentioned Djibouti, another example in your column, and maybe this is what Cambodia is going to end up looking like. It started as a civilian multi-purpose port. It has evolved into what you describe as a heavily fortified base, more than 250,000 square feet of underground bunkers. What's all that for?
Who knows? I mean, the Chinese have a long track record of relying on bunkers at their strategic locations and facilities inside of China to hide armaments and nuclear weapons and other munitions. We just don't know what's really under the hood there. And we'll probably never know. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of transparency that the Chinese have shrouded this broader expansion in. What we really need to be concerned about, I think, is that a lot of these initial, what appeared to be civilian projects in places like Djibouti, places like the United Arab Emirates, the places like Gwadar and Pakistan, are starting to be sort of augmented with military might, tangible military assets. And what happens is that the Chinese are going to be able to project and influence along these key choke points and frankly, I think potentially prevent us from shifting resources and personnel into China's near periphery in the event of a contingency. And so the Chinese are going to be able to build out this network over time that will be a lot cheaper, a lot less expensive, and a lot less sort of cost prohibitive than our global footprint. But they're going to be able to do so in a way that actually undermines and undercuts our ability to project strength. And that's sort of where I think the Chinese are heading right now.
Well, you're right that once commercial projects in the Belt and Road Initiative are now being retrofitted with military assets. Was this the purpose of Belt and Road all along as we consider what the Biden administration is trying to pitch here at the G20 as an alternative?
Michelle was right. It's time for the United States to offer alternatives to some of these countries who I think are eager or perhaps concerned, not just about the debt trap diplomacy aspect of Belt and Road, but also whether some of these projects could potentially be militarized. I wouldn't go so far as to say that a lot of these projects went in with a strategic intent to militarize them, but China is opportunistic. And China also recognizes, and they publish this in their military doctrine and their military strategy, the notion that they can leverage China's exceedingly growing global footprint, that commercial footprint, for military purposes and to confound and replace the United States. These aren't secrets. This isn't Craig Singleton saying this. This is what the Chinese openly say in their doctrine and in their commentary. And I just think taking them for at their word is probably an important element for U.S. policymakers to proactively counter these moves.
So when you see Joe Biden, in the case of this past weekend at the G20 and also making the visit to Vietnam, when you squint your eyes, do you see a global South that could be friendlier to the U.S. if the right investments are made in this case? Or does China have such a head start that it's not possible?
Potentially. I mean, I think a lot of these countries have sort of been wising up to the fact that not all of China's aid or these infrastructure projects are sort of without risk or without strings. They certainly are. They're looking for alternatives. There are moments when it makes sense for the United States to get involved, and there are other times when perhaps other partners like Japan are better suited to support those types of projects. And while Xi Jinping obviously chose to not attend the G20 summit for, I think, a host of different reasons. The reality is that next month he's going to be hosting the Belt and Road Forum in China that'll have more than 80 countries attending. And I think that's a clearer demonstration, particularly as Michelle mentioned, across the global South, that China's message is not falling on deaf ears. It is resonating. The question is, how does the United States, how does its partners work together, I think, to come up with an alternative architecture that may be a little more appealing to some of these countries.
Read his column in the New York Times. I found it on the terminal, by the way, guest essay from Craig Singleton, China's military is going global. Craig, great to have you back. Let's keep this conversation going. He's senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Let's assemble our panel for their take. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino back together again. Bloomberg Politics contributors coming off the weekend. Great to have you both here. Jeanne, I'll start with you as this president makes his way home. Was it worth the journey, and did he use his time well? I'm hearing more about how tired he was than initiatives that were brought forth at the G20, but the media is not fair that way. What's your take?
Yeah, it is a long trip. It was a whirlwind. I'm hearing a lot of disappointment, I think largely due to the language of the communique in terms of Ukraine, also in terms of climate change. People think it wasn't tough enough. But I do have to say, there were a couple of big proposals when it comes to confronting China. And you just mentioned one of them, this big global infrastructure proposal, also reinvestment in the World Bank. Those are two big initiatives that, should they come to fruition, really lend to the president's ability to confront China and the world's ability to confront China. So I think it's a little short-sighted just to look at the language of the communique, because it was weak and it wasn't as strong as it was last year. But there were other things to come out of this meeting as well.
We'll have a lot more time to get into this, Rick, but in our minute that we have here, how concerned are you about the way that communique was finalized?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think they knew going in it would be a challenge to try and get something as strong as it was a year ago, especially as it relates to the Ukraine and Russia. But look, I think people are really missing the importance of Biden's trip to Vietnam. That's front line of concerned trade, investment, and military with China. And I think that trip alone probably was worth the price of admission.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
President Biden is making his way back to Washington from the trip over the weekend of the G20, the stop in Vietnam, and he's going to be stopping in Alaska on the way, where we do expect remarks from the POTUS on this anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We talked about this at the end of last week. Some criticized the president for not being either at Ground Zero in New York, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, or here in Washington across the river at the Pentagon. But of course, the administration was well represented in all of these areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about the anniversary later this hour in a special conversation with David Westin. As we mentioned, though, he's on his way back following the mission to the G20 and spoke in his news conference in Vietnam about the problems facing China, generating headlines on the terminal. The economic trouble in China may, in fact, in his view, keep China from invading Taiwan. Here's what he said.
He has his hands full right now. He has overwhelming unemployment with his youth. One of the major economic tenets of his plan isn't working at all right now. I'm not happy for him that, but it's not working. So he's trying to figure out, I suspect, I don't know, just like I would, trying to figure out what to do about the particular crisis they're having now. But I don't think it's a crisis relating to conflict between China and the United States. As a matter of fact, I think it's less likely to cause that kind of conflict.
Less likely to cause that kind of conflict. And of course, Joe Biden knows a bit about what it's like to deal with economic strife, referring there to the possibility of him meeting with President Xi and exactly where our relationship stands. We reassembled our panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino joined, Bloomberg Politics contributors. What's your thought on that, Rick? There was so much talk about who was not in the room in the case of President Xi, President Putin. Is Joe Biden correct on this, that President Xi's got his hands full to the point where he's not so much of a threat?
Yeah, I don't think you can diminish the threat just by the fact that domestic economic circumstances and unemployment are running rampant in Beijing. If anything, I mean, frankly, I would worry more about that. I think domestic turmoil has always been one of the contributors to adventurism around the world, try to take people's mind off of their own circumstance by creating this nationalistic fervor that, allows you to take an action, for instance, an invasion of Taiwan. So, and by the way, I mean, I think we've seen Xi talking a lot like that lately. So I would be more concerned, not less concerned, by an unstable domestic economic situation in China. And frankly, shocked that the president would think that China has taken its eye off the ball at a time when all we're talking about is their adventurism around the world.
What's your thought there, Jeanne? Does the economic trouble in China, God knows they've been trying to stimulate the economy to come back to life here, does it embolden President Xi, or does it make him feel cornered?
I have to say, I agree with Rick on this. I think anytime you're looking at a leader in the modern world who is having trouble domestically and at home, there is always a concern that they look outward where they can have more influence and can potentially change the narrative at home. So I do think it is a real concern. I was also real concerned to hear the Ministry of State Security say the other day that there's a prospect that Xi may not come to the bilateral meeting in November in San Francisco. That I think is very troubling, because you want there to be conversation between the United States president and Xi Jinping. You want that kind of high-level diplomatic engagement, even if nothing comes of it. The fact that he stayed away from India and now potentially may stay away from the November meeting is, I think, another sign of trouble as the U.S. continues to, despite what the president says, continues to befriend people right on his doorstep, something that upset Putin in the last 20 years and something that the U.S. is now doing to China can have a backlash effect as well. Not that we shouldn't be doing it, but you've got to keep your eye on how that's read in China. And so all of those things, I think, are a real concern, not a reason to say things are looking up from the perspective of the U.S. and China's relationship.
Well, the president's approach to China certainly getting a lot of criticism from Republican presidential candidates, say he's too soft on China. Case in point, Nikki Haley, who talked about it on Sunday morning on CNN.
How much more has to happen for Biden to realize you don't send cabinet members over to China to appease them. You start getting serious with China and say, we're not going to put up with it. They keep sending different cabinet officials over, Jake, and it's embarrassing. You sent Raimondo right after she got hacked. Her emails got hacked by the Chinese. You sent all of these cabinet officials over after a Chinese spy balloon went over our country. They are putting a Chinese spy base up on Cuba off the coast of Florida. And don't wait for the fact that they are going to be sending Chinese military troops there. What are we doing appeasing China?
Of course, the White House, Rick, thinks it's avoiding conflict, not appeasing China, but trying to keep the train on the tracks here and not have a real Cold War. Who's right?
Look, I mean, whether we like it or not, I mean, China is acting very provocatively. Nikki Haley is absolutely right. You know, their relations with the Solomon Islands is pressing our Pacific presence. Their bases in Djibouti or military bases, their spy locations in Cuba. I mean, I'd ask Jeanne, what the heck are we? How could we get criticism for going to places like Ukraine and Vietnam if this is the actions of our chief competitor, China? Look, whether we like it or not, and you can call it a Cold War, you can call it something else, but we are in an active global competition for the favor of nations that are free versus those that are associating with dictators around the world. And anybody who doesn't think that this is an active competition is misreading the tea leaves of the world movement right now. And so I really think that Nikki Haley nailed it right. I mean, she knows that this competition exists. She's seen it firsthand in the Trump administration. And I think, frankly, it is one of the very few presidential candidates who's espousing a more robust and capable U.S. foreign policy. And frankly, I'd much rather see Xi standing next to Nikki Haley than to President Biden, who somehow thinks that he deserves a break because he's got a bad economy.
Well, that brings us to the issue of the way he comported himself, some of the things that Joe Biden said on the visit. Jeanne, you can certainly weigh in on what Rick said, but you know, if you don't know whether it's morning or night, it is a little bit difficult to express authority or to project power, you might suggest. You had this moment.
It is evening, isn't it? This round the world in 5 days is interesting.
It is evening, he said. He was even asked how he was doing by a couple of reporters who told him that it was, in fact, evening time.
Good evening, Mr. President.
Good
How are
evening.
you?
Well, thank you.
Good.
These 5-day trips around the world are no problem.
I can imagine. It is evening, I'd like to remind you.
These 5-day trips around the world, no problem, Jeanne. How did the president do? Did he just make his life more difficult here? Because when we're talking about the age issue, the cognitive issue, it's trips like these that people have in mind.
That's right. But, you know, listen, if any of us went on a trip to India, to Vietnam, and back to Alaska, did what the president has done in 5 days, it's a long trip. I think he was making the kind of Biden offhanded comments that he usually makes, and it's no surprise for anybody who has followed him. And I also don't think anybody can accuse Joe Biden of not understanding the need to confront and contain China. He is the president who has done that arguably more than any president in the modern era, has turned our attention from China. To the Asia Pacific. He's gotten criticized today for not being here for 9/11. But let's not forget, he is willing to take that hit because he is coming back from a very important trip to India and to Vietnam to really, really make the case that we do have to focus our attention not on the Middle East, where it has been for the last 25 years for good reason, but to China, where we confront a big threat and we have a big competition. So I think it's short-sighted to say that he doesn't recognize that. I do agree with Rick on this, members of his own party are not clear about this. Let's just think back to what Nikki Haley had to say to Vivek Ramaswamy and others during the debate. So there is a debate to be had in the Republican Party where they're even debating today, as they come back to the House, whether to give Ukraine the money it needs to have this confrontation with Russia. So those are things that the Republican Party does have to work out. There's a lot more unanimity on the side of the Democrats when it comes to that.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We've been talking a lot about China and the Biden administration's relationship or lack thereof with that country. It was a very different look in Vietnam. After the president left the G20, he went to Vietnam for a brief set of meetings where they did announce a comprehensive strategic partnership and enhanced trade relationship that puts the U.S. on par with China, which is something that the late Senator John McCain spent years pushing for. As we reassemble our panel with Rick Davis and Jeanne, Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, some pretty touching moments and pretty good optics, I would argue, for the president in Vietnam as he visited the memorial to John McCain in Hanoi. He left a challenge coin at the memorial, laid a wreath, and spent some time talking with the two service members who was there. We should note, by the way, that former Secretary of State John Kerry, also, of course, a Vietnam War veteran, was also with him at that moment. Rick, I suspect that memorial wouldn't be there if it weren't in part for your efforts, and I wonder your thoughts as you see the president actually get business done in Vietnam that John McCain would have loved to have seen himself.
First of all, I had nothing to do with that memorial. Strictly the Vietnamese government put that up.
How about that?
Because I would not want to be held to blame for, on that memorial, it refers to John McCain as an Air Force air pirate. And he didn't mind being called an air pirate, but he did not like being called Air Force. That's a Navy pilot that was proud of his wings. So look, I mean, John McCain always had a fond memory of that lake because his arms and knees were broken when he ejected from his aircraft after being hit by a rocket, and he landed in the middle of that lake. And he said, if not for the Vietnamese that pulled him out of that lake, beating and stabbing him, he would have drowned. So, he always had a kind of quirky way of looking at things from an optimistic point of view. But I thought it was nice that the president stopped at that memorial and showed his respect to John McCain. And I think that, it just betrays what we need more of in foreign policy, which is we can debate all we want at home, but when it comes to what we think the overseas priorities of our country are, they should be together. And John McCain and President Biden had a lot of disagreements, but ultimately, when they came together, they did good things for the country abroad, and were on the same page more than they weren't. So kudos to the president for taking time out of his schedule to do that.
Jeanne, I'm struck by the name of Franklin Foer's book about Joe Biden, The Last Politician. The optics of this visit to the memorial, Joe Biden coming to the aid of Mitch McConnell, at least optically speaking. Again, when he was asked by reporters about Mitch McConnell's freezing up before the cameras, it does feel like it's the end of an era, or at least a generation in politics, when you see these events unfold before your eyes.
It absolutely does. And, I talk to students every day between the ages of, 17 to 22, 23. And for them, I know we're going to be talking about 9/11 in a little bit. They weren't even born, many of them, when 9/11 occurred, which is, hard to even wrap your head around. And as they look at politicians like Joe Biden or Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi, or think about people like the former Senator John McCain, these do seem like relics to a certain extent from a past generation. I have to say, I really thought it was a very good visit to Hanoi. The president described this as a historic moment overcoming a bitter past, and that is an apt description. And for Vietnam to put the U.S. in its highest diplomatic category on par with China that is a big advance as well. So everything from the discussion of semiconductors, the memorializing John McCain, those are all important, as was the president's diplomatic outreach to Hanoi. These are very big steps forward for the president and for the United States from a foreign policy and economic perspective.
Mm-hmm. We're going to bring in David Westin, as I promised, in just a moment to talk with us on this September 11th. I'd love to hear from both of you on what the president is and is not doing today. Quickly, before we get to David, Rick, is it a problem that Joe Biden is swinging through Alaska on his way back to mark this occasion instead of being at Ground Zero at the Pentagon or in Shanksville?
Yeah, I think that if the trade-off was doing, as Jeanne described, the work that he did in Vietnam, I think it was well worth the trade-off. Joe Biden's been making these visits on 9/11 for 22 years, and I don't think there's any criticism that should be sent his way. This is a day where, frankly, bipartisanship should reign supreme.
Yeah. He will be delivering remarks, Jeanne. He is, in fact, paying tribute on this day. Does it matter where you are as the commander-in-chief?
I think ideally you do want to be at one of the memorials, but he is one person. He can't be everywhere. He made the hard decision to do this very important foreign policy trip, and he sent the vice president in his wake to New York. So, it's probably not exactly where he wants to be, but he had to make a tough choice like all leaders, and he made it. And I think from everybody's perspective, it is the right choice. But it is important that he's going to stop and take time to remember the victims.
Yeah. Great to have you both here. Great conversation today. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our signature panel on Sound On, Bloomberg Politics contributors.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
The question you'll surely hear someone ask today, and maybe you've been asked already in the office or as you're going to the store or whatever your day includes here, is where were you on 9/11? For many, the answer is at home, right? It was in the morning, watching TV, watching morning shows like Good Morning America, GMA, where the anchors had no idea what was unfolding.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City. One report said, and we can't confirm any of this, that a plane may have hit one of the two towers of the World Trade Center. But again, you're seeing the live pictures here.
Bloomberg's David Westin was at work that morning as we hear Diane Sawyer talking there on GMA. David was the president of ABC News, and he joins us right now from New York to recall the events of that day and what they would lead to. David, thank you for being here. I'm so glad that you could join us. You were watching GMA as the boss. What did you think? What went through your mind when you heard Diane Sawyer say this?
Well, a lot goes through my mind. Even as I listened to it again, I remember it terribly well. I mean, I used to get in every morning before 7 o'clock because that's when Good Morning America came on the air. And I watched like 5 or 6 monitors that I had in my office to see what everybody was doing. And I remember looking up when we were in commercial break, actually, on GMA, and seeing on CNN sort of smoke coming out of a high level of one of the trade towers. And I turned down the volume to figure out what was going on. At that point, nobody had any idea what it was, but I called down to the control room and said, something's going on at the World Trade Center, get out of commercial, go to the full network. And we went to the full network, really, as you could hear from Diane, not fully aware of what had happened, but there were reports there was an aircraft that had gone in, and they went to full network mode, special report we called it. And as they watched, it was Diane Sawyer and Charlie Gibson. We all watched together as that second airliner went crashing into the second tower, and Charlie said, it looks like an airliner's just gone into the second tower.
What happens next in a situation like that? People are watching the anchors, but there are dozens, if not a couple of hundred folks behind them. What happened internally at ABC News? Do you pick up the phone? Who do you start calling?
Well, you get the desk is there. You get everybody in as fast as you can, figure out where people are. Frankly, Joe, one of the first questions is, where are our people? Do we have any people who are at risk down at the World Trade Center? And where else could there be an attack? I will say we were, I'm not sure fortunate is the right word, but we were in a position to have an idea about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, because John Miller, who worked for us, had trekked into Afghanistan about 18 months before, and we had aired what turned out to be the last Western interview with Osama bin Laden from his camp in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. We had covered that story, and I had talked, frankly, with some senior military people in the months before, saying, what's the biggest threat we have? And they said to a person, it's a terrorist attack. And so I had a pretty good sense pretty early on that it was terrorism, and then it was Al-Qaeda. So in that sense, we had a little bit of a jump on it. But then you figure out how can you cover the story as best you can. Who can you get down there? A close follow-on to that is, can we send them down there safely? We had a whole discussion, not a long one, but a discussion. Do they have to have hazmat suits on? Because we're not sure what this was and what the effects might be on the people in the surrounding areas. How can we get video out of there? We're a television organization. You got to get video out of there. How are we going to audio? We were fortunate because we had Don Daler, one of our reporters, who actually lived near there, and he got on the telephone pretty quickly.
It also turned out that you had a reporter pretty close to the scene, but didn't realize, following a series of emails from what appeared to be a stranger, that George Stephanopoulos was trying to get news to the news.
Boy, I'd forgotten about that, Joe. That's exactly right. Poor George was down there trying to get through, and everybody thought it was a crank call. It took us quite a while to figure out that actually, yes, George actually was nearby, near ground zero, and he was trying to report, and we finally got him in the air. We got John Miller in the chair pretty quickly. We stuck with Diane and with Charlie for about 40 or 45 minutes. Peter Jennings was in the building, and he was reluctant, frankly, to go on because he said they're doing such a good job. But I said, Peter, you're our lead anchor. You got to get in the chair. And he sat there with John Miller, and we covered. We went on right through till Saturday morning, no nonstop, no commercial breaks, no nothing. But we covered it in part that first day with John Miller tapping into police frequencies because he'd been in the police department and he had a bunch of buddies there, and he was giving us a lot of the reporting.
You mentioned you try to find out who you have, and you had a reporter on Air Force One. I don't know how long it was before you were able to make contact with Ann Compton, David, but her story is iconic.
Well, Ann Compton happened to be the radio pool that day, and wonderful radio, longtime White House correspondent for ABC News and ABC News Radio. And we all remember President George W. Bush was in Florida speaking actually to an elementary school class when this all happened. We've all seen that iconic video when they first told him what was going on. And then they hurried everybody onto Air Force One. President Bush made a couple of brief remarks. They hurried him onto Air Force One because they wanted to get him, make sure he was safe. They weren't sure how to attack him. And so we just were told, Ann's on the plane. She called in. She said, we're going wheels up, but we don't know where we're going. I don't know when I can talk to you. I'll let you know. And so next time we heard from her, they had put down, actually in Louisiana, as I recall, where the base was, for refueling. And she gave us from the tarmac a quick report on what was going on Air Force One. Then they took off again, and they went to another air base. And again, she talked to us from there. President Bush spoke from there because he didn't make it back to Washington actually until that evening, and then addressed the nation from the Oval Office.
That's incredible to think that you had people truly in all of the right places. You couldn't have planned it better if you had been given a tip on this, David. But I'm talking to you now as someone who our viewers and listeners know as a journalist, as a broadcast journalist, an anchor, the guy who asks the questions. You were an executive at that point as the president of ABC News. To what extent did the events of that day and the following days inform your next career that you now enjoy?
Well, I think, as you know, Joe, as well or better than I do, everything you've ever experienced or known or done informs what you do when you're in these jobs on the air. But it's a very different thing. One of the wonderful experiences of being on the air, having spent so much time, I was there for 14 years behind the camera, is you have an understanding of what else is in the iceberg, the stuff below the surface. And I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, one of the first things we did was we marshaled as much troops as we could get down to the hospitals in the area because we were convinced there would be all kinds of wounded coming in. And then as the day unfolded, we realized nobody was coming because they were all dead. And it was a terrible moment. Another moment, an hour into it, I got a call in the control room saying there are people jumping from the towers. Do we show it? And I said, no, you report they're jumping, but you do not show it because that's somebody's loved one that they're seeing commit suicide, essentially.
It's just absolutely horrible to think that this happened and that we watched it as it was happening. David, it was folks like you making those decisions. And I know that you held an event with some children. I heard you speak about this, school children, which was a Saturday morning show that Peter Jennings used to conduct. And this was about telling them about what happened on 9/11 and showing them the actual video. They couldn't discern between what was happening then and whether it was real now. And I bring this to you because it's something that every television news network has to grapple with. And some have annually shown the video of the towers being hit, of people jumping, of the towers falling. You made the decision not to do that, didn't you?
No, I did. As a result of that town hall meeting with the children, Peter Jennings was, I think, the best breaking news anchor ever. But he was particularly gifted with children, and he wanted to do, and we wanted to do a special that Saturday to try to explain to kids what had happened. And we actually had a professor of child psychology from Princeton there who said, one of the things you have to understand is small children don't understand it's not happening again. They think that every time they see it, there's another building going down. And so from the car on the way home, I got on the phone to the desk and I said, okay, we will never show moving video of that again on ABC News. We'll show a still, but never moving video. Because at that point, Joe, it had become almost like music. People were putting in their bumpers. They were putting in their promos. I mean, you kept seeing these towers collapse. And it wasn't telling anybody. I mean, it wasn't communicating. It was just pure emotion. And I said, we'll never do it again. And we didn't. We never showed a moving image again because it wasn't informing anybody. It was just pushing buttons that we didn't need to push.
I think that's incredible. And it's so important here while we look back 22 years later, because some networks continue to show this in promotional framing, to your point. And I would say this isn't just about kids, David. I don't think adults in many cases are helped by seeing that over again, are they?
No, I don't think so. There's no information I'm getting. But again, I want to go back to the relatives, the loved ones of those people. They're watching their loved ones die. And, again and again. What are we getting out of that? But I'll just add one other thing that people may not understand. We spent hours that day not being able to get any information out of the government. Now, in fairness, they didn't know what was going on, but the president was in the air. The vice president was on some protected location beneath the White House. And we kept trying to get anybody from the government to tell us what's going on. We got silence, with one exception. I'll give him great credit. George Pataki, the governor of New York, would actually get on the phone and say, this is what we know, we don't know. Because we had reports coming in of all kinds of bizarre things happening. We couldn't confirm or deny. And the question is, do you report it?
Yeah. Was this the first thing you thought about when you woke up today?
Of course. Yeah, always. Always. But by the way, your discussion about President Biden not being in town, in some sense, it's kind of sad because we're not making a big deal of it. In some ways, it's healthy.
Yeah.
We need to go on. We need to remember it, but we need to recover. We need to go on. I couldn't live at that level of emotional distress that we had in the days and the weeks and even the months after 9/11. You have to get over it and go on with your life sometime.
I can't thank you enough for sharing that with us. David Westin, our dear friend at Bloomberg, and of course, one of many lives that changed that day. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.